Okay, this is lecture 17, the corticospinal and corticobulbar fiber. So now we're getting into the motor tracts. Before we were looking at all the sensory tracts, now we're looking at the motor tracts. The two main motor tracts we've learned about so far are corticospinal and corticobulbar. That's these guys right here. That's these guys right in here. Corticospinal and corticobulbar. Corticospinal, which for us is going to be in light blue, presents as blue on the whiteboard here. It goes through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, and then it goes through the middle 3/5 of the crus cerebri. The crus cerebri we'll introduce in 1 second, but that's the midbrain. That's where the midbrain is. Then the corticobulbar, this tract goes through the genu, which we said is it's kind of like the knee, right? There's a divot in here. And that goes through the genu or knee of the internal capsule, and it's going to run medial to the corticospinal fiber. So it's going to be running more on the inside. Quickly, the crus cerebri up top, it says it's the anterior portion of the midbrain, also known as the cerebral anterior peduncles, which is AKA the Mickey Mouse ears. So if you see that midbrain structure, the Mickey Mouse ears of that structure is referred to as the cerebral anterior peduncles, also known as the crus cerebri, and that's where motor neurons are going to run through. Okay, here we have our structures here. So you have your basically your brain structure, your brain, the midbrain, pons, medulla, and spinal cord. As you go down, again, you see both of these tracts. So these are our two tracts. These are our motor neuron tracts. It's important to note that even though we don't have arrows pointing down, these guys are coming down. So here's your initial corticospinal tract in blue, which is going to cross over at the level of the medulla. It'll have desiccation crossing over at the medulla. And then you have the corticobulbar tract, which is going to come down more medially than the corticospinal. And again, it's going to cross over. However, this one crosses over at the level of the pons. Both of them are considered upper motor neurons, and then they're going to synapse onto lower motor neurons, and then they're going to exit towards the skeletal muscle. It's important to note that I believe we mentioned that they can synapse at intermotor neurons first, right? Or interneurons, and those interneurons can then synapse at, synapse at these guys, at the lower motor neurons. So this is basically more detail about the tracts, right?
So just quickly, the cortical bulbar tract and the lateral corticospinal tract, which Darius has said, are both going to be for voluntarily skeletal muscle contraction compared to the other tracts that we're going to get into later, which are going to be autonomic, so more visceral. And what we're looking at is both tracts, as Darius just ran through, and you could see that there's upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons, and there's going to be different syndromes and diseases based on which neuron is damaged or where the lesion occurs. Then we're going to have to understand how these upper motor neurons are categorized with their own symptoms and the lower motor neurons are with their other symptoms. If we run through the lateral corticospinal tract, we can see that in the light blue, or the blue in this case, that 90% will cross over in the medulla and 10% will not cross over in the medulla. And the interesting fact about this is that 90% that crosses over the medulla is more lateral corticospinal. It makes the lateral corticospinal tract, and the 10% that does not cross over makes the anterior corticospinal tract. And we said yesterday that the corticospinal tract actually splits into two, so the lateral and the anterior.
Yep.
But we're really more focused on the 90% that's crossing over in the medulla compared to that 10% that does not cross over. There is a small amount of corticospinal fibers that regulate sensory input by terminating in the dorsal horn. So here we're saying that, hey, look, these are upper motor neurons that are going to synapse, and we know that the upper motor neurons are going to synapse in the lateral and the anterior white matter of the spinal cord.
Yep.
And they're not supposed to be synapsing in the dorsal horn.
Yeah.
That's for sensory signals. However, we're going to have some of them, or even it could even be lower motor neuron. Actually, no, it has to be an upper motor neuron.
Yeah.
Synapsing in the dorsal horn, and if that's the case, then we're basically influencing the sensory with using motor neurons, and then basically just the pathway of what it takes to go from the cortex all the way down to the spinal cord is the cortex. Then we go to the corona radiata. and then we go through the internal capsule. Then we go through the crus cerebri, which is the midbrain.
Yep.
Then we go through the basilar pons. Then we go through the medulla pyramids, which is where you cross over. Then we go to the spinal cord, and then we synapse on alpha and gamma motor neurons in spinal ventral horn.
Yeah.
So that is how you connect upper motor neurons to lower motor neurons.
Yeah, that's huge. That's going to be a really big pathway to understand. And then just to stem off that, you have the corticobulbar tract. And just the main things about it is that this guy starts in the cerebral cortex, so starts up top on the lateral aspect of the primary motor area, and it's going to end all the way in the brainstem. It's important to note that this guy is going to end in the brainstem, whereas the other pathway ends all the way down in the spinal cord. This guy, the corticobulbar tract, stands for cortex to bulbar or cortex to brain. This is going to be cortex or, cortex to the
brainstem,
okay.
bulbar.
Oh, was I saying
brainstem.
brain? So corticobulbar, cortex to brainstem, cortex to brainstem, and this is cortex to spine or cortex to the spinal cord. This guy's going to end in the brainstem, and it's going to synapse on cranial nerves for your head and your neck, and that's exactly what the function is. It gives you voluntary control of your head and neck muscles. We said both of these tracts go through the anterior portion of the midbrain, also known as the crus cerebri, and then this is our last thing that we mentioned over here, which is spinal shock.
So spinal shock occurs by bilateral damage to the spinal cord. So the spinal cord has to be damaged on both sides, and what happens is that at the initial phase before spinal shock really occurs, you have to have damage to your lower motor neuron. So you're going to see lower motor neuron symptoms first. The big ones that are considered to be a lower motor neuron symptom is hyporeflexia, hypotonia, and fasciculations. So basically, after 4 to 6 weeks, you'll then see upper motor neuron signs that become visible. And this is when spinal shock starts. Mm-hmm. So basically what you're seeing is that due to an upper motor neuron injury, lower motor neurons are become damaged. Why is it that happens? It's because that as the upper motor neuron cannot synapse on the lower motor neuron, now the lower motor neuron is becoming weak because it's not sending its signal to the skeletal muscle because it's not being synapsed on by the upper motor neuron due to a lesion in the upper motor neuron.
Yeah.
So this is what spinal shock is. It occurs usually from upper motor neuron syndromes. And you would see patients coming in with a lower motor neuron signs or symptoms for the first 4 to 6 weeks.
Yeah, definitely.